A nice improvement for our application would be to store our searches in a database. Visual Studio contains a number of useful data tools. We'll look at the Data Sources window and the drag and drop binding in this movie. I'm inside Visual Studio and I've opened a solution called InfoReader Data, which contains one project called InfoReader v4. I've got this main window.xaml file, which is a continuation from the other movies in this chapter. And I'm going to take the information when you click on either of these search buttons, and I'm going to store it in the database. And then I'm going to show you your history of your searches over in this list box on the History tab. The first thing I need to do is add a database. To do that, I'm going to go to my project, right-click, and choose Add Existing Item. Then I'm going to navigate out to my desktop, find the exercise file folder, and look in the Assets folder. Be sure and change this drop-down to Show All Files. For today, I'm going to use a compact SQL database, and the name of this database is history.sdf. So I'll choose this one and click on Add. Now Visual Studio realizes that I have picked a data source and it's asking me if I want to make a special type of data access tool called a dataset. I'm going to go ahead and say Next on this. Visual Studio then queries my database and shows me a list of all of the tables. In this example, I only have one table with 2 columns. I will check this first checkbox and then verify that I like this dataset name down here. If I do, I'll click on Finish. A number of things happened when I clicked the Finish button. First of all, it made a copy of the history.sdf file in my project. It also added a connection to my Server Explorer. If you don't have Server Explorer open it now. You can find it in the View menu or docked to the side of your window. You can see I now have this history.sdf connection, and if I expand this, I can see the tables inside that database. I can even right-click on this history table and choose Show Table Data. Currently, I have no rows in this table, so let me put 2 rows in there. I'll come over to this column and type in WPF and hit Enter, and then I'll type in lynda.com and press Enter, and then I'll close this window. Not only did it add the database, but it also generated this history.dataset.xsd file and all of its companion files. Let me double-click on the history dataset and show you the designer. This is the table adapter that is responsible for loading the data into my table from the database and sending the updated data back to the database. You see it has a fill method. I'm going to use that to get the data. And to put a new row in the data set, I'm going to add a brand new query. I'll right-click and choose Add Query. Then I'll click on Next. And I'm going to come down here and choose Insert. Adds a new row to the table. Then I click on Next. And I'm going to go ahead and accept the defaults. This is the SQL statement that'll be run against the database. Just choose the defaults and click on Next. Then I get to name my query. And again, I'm going to choose the defaults. Insert Query. Now I am finished. I click on the Finish button. And you'll see at the bottom of the table adapter is now Insert Query. And then the @P1 means that I have to pass some sort of parameter in to that query. Now I am ready to do some data binding. Let me switch over to my main window.xaml file and switch to the History tab and select the list box. I'm going to click on this Zoom to Fit to make it a little bit easier to see. There's a special window for drag and drop data binding available inside Visual Studio. It's in the Data menu and it's called Show Data Sources. I'm going to go ahead and click on the stick pin, the Auto Hide button, and on my machine it docks itself to the bottom left-hand side of the window. Notice that my data set is showing up here, and the table that's inside my data set is showing up there as well. Now, for drag and drop data binding, I can pick this table up and drag it over and drop it on my list box. Before I do that, though, let me point out my XAML that I have down here. There's only a few items in here. Keep an eye on that when I drag this over and drop it on the list box. You see what happened is that Visual Studio added 3 new lines. It wrote a display member path, what to show. It'll show this column called search text. It shows that it's bound to a source. This is the WPF and Silverlight way to set up bindings. This tells WPF to monitor the underlying source and load this list box with whatever data is inside this data set. And then I also have a selected value path for this field here, History ID. That's in case the user selects an item, I can use this as the identifier of the row that they selected. I'm not going to be using that in my demo. I'll choose Debug, Start Debugging, save my changes, and then I'm going to click on the History tab, and there I can see my 2 items from my database. So I've successfully set up a data binding. The next part of the demo will be when the user types a new string here and clicks on one of these buttons, I want to add it to the database and make sure that this list box updates. To do that, I'm going to switch to the code behind. While I'm inside my designer, I can press F7, which switches me over to the code view. Now, when I did the drag and drop binding, Visual Studio wrote a lot of code in the window loaded event, and it's very hard to read. So I'm going to replace this with a slightly more readable version. I'm going to delete the code here by pressing delete. And then I'm going to take this pre-written code here and cut it and paste it right above the window loaded event. And then I'm going to uncomment the code by pressing Control-K, Control-U. This is going to create an instance of the data set. It's also going to create an instance of that table adapter that knows how to load and update and insert my data. And I'm going to do that here because I'm going to use it elsewhere in my code. So I'm doing it outside the boundaries of this loaded event. Then I'm going to take this commented code down here and cut it, Control-X, and paste it in the loaded event, and then uncomment it, Control-K, Control-U. And what this does, and I see I have an error here. I will click here and then do a Control period, get the smart tag, and then say using system.windows.data. That will fix my code. What this does is it looks in my XAML and finds something that was created by Visual Studio called History Dataset. Then it creates a table adapter, instantiates one, fills the dataset, and then sets up something special called a collection view source, and then moves to the first row. When I call the send to Bing method, I'm going to insert a new row by calling the table adapter.insert query. That's the query we built earlier today. I'm going to pass in the string from the text box, the search string. And then to make sure that it updates correctly, I'm going to call the table adapter.fill, which refills the data and then it rebinds to the list box. At this point, I think I'm ready to run the application. I'm going to press F5 to debug the application and then click yes. Verify that I only have 2 items in my list box. Then I'll come over here and type in Silverlight and click the Get RSS button. There's my RSS coming back from Bing, and when I click on the History tab, my new item has been added to the list box. If I were to look inside the database, I'd also see that the data is stored in the database. Now there's one more type of data binding I want to talk about in this chapter. That is called XML binding, and it's the topic of the next movie.